Hi there, I'm Renos Vakis, lead economist at the World Bank, and your host for Accelerating Development Ideas for Impact. This is not your typical podcast. It's an AI powered conversation brought to you by the World Bank Institute for Economic Development, where we unpack the latest research with one goal in mind, turning big ideas into real world impact. Let's get started.
Thank you for the introduction, Renos. Think back to a moment when education quietly changed the direction of your life. Maybe a teacher who believed in you, a class that opened the door you didn't even know existed, or a degree that reshaped what you thought was possible. Most of us feel that impact personally, but we rarely think about it at a global scale. That's why this report stopped me in my tracks. We're looking at distributional growth accounting, education, and the reduction of global poverty, 1980 through 2019. And what it argues is bold. Education hasn't just helped individuals, it may be one of the most powerful forces reshaping the entire world economy.
It is absolutely massive. For decades, we have watched extreme poverty drop. We have seen the numbers go down, but we have struggled to pinpoint exactly what drove that change. Was it just technology? Was it capital investment? This report finally isolates the variable, and the answer is education.
Right. And usually when we talk about education, we talk about it as a social good, something that's nice to have. But this data suggests it's actually the primary economic engine for the poor. I saw one statistic in there that really stood out. Between 1980 and 2019, education accounted for 45% of global economic growth.
Precisely. And if you look specifically at the poorest 20% of the world's population, that number jumps to nearly 60%. Think about that for a second. 60% of the income gains for the world's most vulnerable people didn't come from finding oil or a sudden tech boom. It came from schooling.
That's huge. It basically means education explains about 1/3 of the total reduction in extreme poverty.
Exactly. It explains 35% of the reduction in the share of people living on less than $2.15. It is the unseen driver of prosperity.
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit. To understand why this matters, we have to look at what the world economy has actually looked like since 1980. The report mentions this concept of the elephant curve. Can you unpack that for us?
So, the elephant curve describes who won and who lost in the global economy. Basically, growth was very high for the middle. Think of rising economies like China and India. And it was sky high for the global elite, the top 1%. But for the poorest people in low-income countries and even the middle class in wealthy countries, growth was actually quite sluggish.
I see. So you have these pockets of stagnation.
Yes, but here is the turning point. Even in that sluggish environment, education provided a floor. For the bottom 50% of the global population, annual income growth was about 2.4%. Without education, that number would have been dismantled. Education contributed nearly half of that growth.
So it was the safety net and the ladder at the same time. And this corresponds with a huge expansion in schools, right?
Oh, the expansion was dramatic. In 1980, only about 20% of the world's working age population had a secondary education. By 2019, that number rose to 55%. We essentially changed the global workforce in a single generation.
That brings us to the how, and this is the part that I found tricky but fascinating. The report uses this method called distributional growth accounting. It sounds complicated, but my understanding is that it changes how we view supply and demand for workers.
It does. This is the core insight for policymakers. Standard economic models usually just look at an individual getting a degree and getting a raise. But this framework looks at the supply effects. When you educate a massive number of people, you increase the supply of skilled workers.
And when supply goes up, the price usually stabilizes.
Exactly. When skilled workers are rare, they demand a huge wage premium, a skill premium. But when you flood the market with educated workers, that premium moderates. At the same time, because there are fewer unskilled workers left, their wages get beat up. So education reduces inequality from both ends.
That connects the dots for me. So it's not just about me getting a diploma, it's about how my diploma changes the labor market for everyone else.
Yes, if education levels had stayed where they were in 1980, global inequality would be significantly higher today because skilled labor would be a scarce luxury resource. The report shows that by expanding access, we democratized the ability to earn.
Okay, but we live in a world of data. Is this just a theoretical model, or do we have proof this actually happened on the ground?
It is backed by an incredible amount of data. We're talking about a micro database covering 154 countries, 97% of the world's population. But to your point about proof, the report validates this with natural experiment.
Like real world test cases?
Yes, take Indonesia in the 1970s. They launched the InPress program, a massive school construction effort. The model in this report accurately predicted that this specific policy led to large income gains concentrated among the poor.
So the model matches the history.
It does. We see the same thing in India with the district primary education program. One additional year of schooling there increased average income for the bottom quintile by roughly 20%. And we saw similar patterns with compulsory schooling laws in the United States. It works across contexts.
This leads us to the policy side of things. If the evidence is this strong, why do we feel like education is sometimes underfunded or at least undervalued in economic planning?
That is the friction point policymakers face. The report highlights a measurement gap. Standard growth models, the ones usually used by finance ministries, estimate that education explains only about 16% of growth for the bottom 20%.
16%? But you said the real number is closer to 60.
Exactly. The standard models miss the general equilibrium effects, those supply-side shifts we talked about. Because they miss that, they undervalue the investment. They don't see that education lifts the whole floor. So we have likely been underinvesting for decades because our calculators were broken.
That's a massive blind spot. And there's another surprise in the data regarding who gets educated. I think most people assume that basic primary school is where you get the biggest bang for your buck, and then returns diminish for high school and college.
Most people assume that, yes, but the data shows the opposite. The returns to schooling are actually convex.
They increase at higher levels. Really? What do the numbers look like?
For primary education, the return is about 25%. For secondary, it jumps to 40%. But for tertiary education, university level, the return is around 85%.
Wow, so university isn't just a luxury, it's a high-yield investment. But doesn't focusing on universities increase inequality, helping the elite get ahead?
Here is the tricky part. It can actually help equity. Remember the supply effect? If you expand access to tertiary education, you break the monopoly the wealthy have on high-skilled jobs. You push down that massive skill premium. So expanding university access is efficient because of high returns, but it's also equitable because it balances the wage structure.
Okay, that makes sense. It stops the degree from being a golden ticket for just a few people. Now, I have to ask about the elephant in the room, technology. We hear all the time that robots and AI are changing the game. How does education fit into a tech-heavy future?
It is a crucial relationship. The report talks about skill-biased technical change. Basically, technology increases the demand for skilled workers. About 30% of education's benefits since 2000 came from this synergy.
So you need the degree to run the machine.
In high-income places like North America or Europe, yes, you need education just to keep up. But here's where it gets interesting and optimistic. In developing regions like Sub-Saharan Africa or parts of India, labor demand from technology hasn't grown as fast, and yet education still reduced poverty there.
Because of the supply effects?
Exactly. Even without a tech boom, simply having a more literate, capable workforce drives growth and creates its own economy. Education is a powerful, independent driver. It doesn't need to wait for the robots to be effective.
That's a really hopeful message. It feels like we're reclaiming the narrative on education. It's not just a social expenditure, it's the main engine.
It really is. The takeaway here is that education has explained between 40 and 65% of the income gains for the world's poorest in our lifetime.
So, for the policymakers listening, stop looking at education as a line item cost. Start looking at it as the primary lever for growth. And don't just stop at primary school, keep pushing access up the ladder.
You know, looking at all this data, it reminds us that policy is ultimately about human potential. When we build a school or fund a scholarship, we aren't just teaching a child to read, we're literally restructuring the global economy to be fairer. We're changing the value of labor itself. The numbers are complex, but the lesson is simple. If you want to fix poverty, you have to invest in the mind. That is the only investment that has consistently paid off for the poorest among us. And it's the only one that guarantees a better future. Over to you, Renus.
Thank you for joining us. You can find the full report on our website. Just follow the link in the description. Be sure to subscribe to be the first to know about upcoming episodes. And before you go, how do you plan to put what you learn into practice? And what topics you'd like us to explore next? We'd love to know. Until then, goodbye.